Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Mark Goodwin, author, writer for Unlimited Hangout, and former editor of Bitcoin Magazine, to discuss a very important and contentious topic, Bitcoin, which is interesting, right? Because this conversation has been evolving. People have been learning about this for a very long time, myself included, even more so recently than ever. And it's so interesting to see how this has evolved, and people who once were very much supportive of it are suddenly very concerned about it. And I think rightly so. But I'm still trying to juggle this conversation myself and trying to the same conversation we've had about a lot of different things along my journey of independent media, which is, a hammer is a tool. It can build a house, it could bash your head in, right? So is that what we're dealing with here? Is Bitcoin something that is a government operation? Was it started by somebody who wanted to fight the government? Is it now being used in a way to suppress us? And even so, if that's the case, can it still be used to fight back? Is there ways that it'll be used to surveil us? Is it going to overlap with artificial intelligence? It's a really interesting and quite frankly terrifying conversation. But I think it behooves us to understand where this goes, the technology itself, and truly whether it is still a internet type case where it will ultimately be the tool we use to fight back, even if it's used to suppress us. So, Mark, thank you for joining today. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks so much, Ryan. Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. I can't possibly echo enough of those sentiments right back at you. As someone who's been in the space now, for close to a decade, not quite, but very close, 24/7, basically. A lot of those questions I don't know the answers to yet, but I'm happy to be here and discuss them, and we'll figure it out together, hopefully.
Well, thanks, brother. And I really appreciate the way you started there, because the truth is we don't. I'm getting increasingly frustrated and tired today of how many people pretend they know exactly what's going on in every story, when it's quite clear that most of us are trying to make sense, read the tea leaves and kind of make sense of limited information, because that's really where most of this ends up. So I'm right there with you. I think there's a lot of people that really want to believe in it. And I with the positives that I can see potentially, I'm there. Like, I want to believe it's possible. But at the same time, I can't stop seeing just the overwhelming nonstop examples of how this could be used in very dangerous ways. And that gets into Bitcoin itself. It also just is blockchain in general, but we can go through all this stuff today. I say we start with a very, the crux of the point, which right now, I argue my audience is more familiar, I think, with crypto, Bitcoin than most. But even myself, again, we're still kind of in the early stages of this. The point being that I think they're pretty aware of how this has gone so far and what our coverage to this point. I recommend someone like James Corbett, for example, or Mark himself, to understand more about this long-term history. But let's start with the main point. Is this, or in your mind, Mark, as your research has shown, is Bitcoin itself, was Satoshi himself, was this a government operation? And I will start with something you wrote, just saying Bitcoin, like money itself, is simply a technological tool. This tool has many differing properties depending on whether it is wielded by an individual or the state itself. And so that kind of sets the tone for the ideas that you seem to see it as, either way. So if it has started like that, that's an interesting statement to take it on. So let's start with that point. Is this, in your mind, started as a government operation?
Yeah, totally. Again, just to get back to the, anyone that says they have 100% an idea what's going on is selling you something and is lying to you, because no one knows. And I think the Satoshi story is like a perfect example of that, because there's really no direct evidence either way, and hard evidence that either this was, released by some, anarchist crypto shadowy coder, some young, maybe Western European American guy. It seems like, English was his main language, but or if it was, directly coming out of, a DARPA or even like an American fintech. And I think the answer is even more confusing when you go to look at, well, like, what even is modern intelligence anymore? It's not really what it was in the 40s and 50s of, guys with pocket protectors and kind of, sitting in offices and doing things. It's really completely gone into and merged, maybe after, Operation Underworld, figuring out, all of this, the mob basically merged, obviously, and Whitney Webb has obviously covered this extensively and has literally written the book on this. And her book actually starts with that. The intelligence merged with the mafia, basically, in wartime, to figure out, hey, what's going on at the docks? We need more information on who's outside, who's in the waters, who's coming in and out. And the people that had that information were the data brokers of the time that were, the mob, the people kind of bootlegging and doing all these things on the ports. So intelligence merged with the mob. And there's a lot of paper trail for that. And then in the next decades, the ensuing decades, that merger kind of kept going further and further into the private sector. And we saw that, specifically with the internet, it came out of DARPA. It was called ARPANET at the time, the Advanced Research Project. And we saw a lot of the technology that was built in Silicon Valley, accepting grants from the NSA and the CIA through Stanford, through Caltech, through Harvard, through MIT. And a lot of these, things we kind of take for granted as like, oh, these are the biggest American private companies. This is free market capitalism working. It's like, well, no, they kind of hid, that there was this really large government intelligence influence in creating these projects. I have a piece coming out tomorrow about the militarization of data brokers. And you can look at, where these projects came and, how Google was, built on computers that were given to Sergey and Larry at Stanford directly from funding from the NSA and the CIA.
Right.
Does that mean Google is from the government? It's hard to say. I mean, it's
Right.
just say what the answer is. But when you look at how it's being used, and what kind of the outcome is, same with the internet. I think you can kind of make a case that it is.
At the very least, we should ask that question is the point. Nobody should ever be
Exactly.
considering that that's not the case with how clearly that overlaps. Like that's my point.
Exactly. And I think I get a lot of shit for this in the Bitcoin space because I just simply propose the fact that, hey, we should be able to ask this. Like, and I think that, there was a thread I had recently that I phrased it very particularly. I was like, if you perhaps can't consider that
Mhm.
maybe this came out of, because you got to be able to sort of objectively look at, your bags, sort of, right? All of these
Right.
people have invested more than their money. I mean, it's really a personality. It's a borderline cult, frankly. And I say that with love for a lot of the cult leaders and those things in the Bitcoin space. But there's so much identity and yeah, like a personality that's associated with this protocol. And I think people are it's really hard for them to consider that maybe they were sort of tricked or there was a Trojan horse here, that this was a project that actually came out of intelligence.
It's real quickly, it's very similar to the
Sure.
partisan field right now, right? Like where it's the same,
Mm,
it's almost another extension of that, where they have identified, like personalized this, that this is who they are. And
totally.
and we'll get into the point about whether this, whether or not it was this way, could it still be used to fight back? But it's interesting that it is such a personalized thing. And it's the same with partisan, the ideologues and everything else we're seeing, that they're incapable of standing back and going, like you're saying, is it at least possible that he could be that way? And the wall comes up. And that
Totally.
I think what we're starting to break through a lot is people that, whether we all have those walls, but we're beginning
Sure.
to become more open in pointing those out in the partisan field. I would say Bitcoin right now is, I think, one you're really breaking down, that people need to stand back and go, it's okay to consider that. We don't have to blindly accept it, but consider whether it could be. That's question everything. That's what we do here.
100%. And also it's like, well, does it really matter? And that's the
Good
other thing
question.
that I think is very confusing about Bitcoin is because, I've sort of created this thesis or this sort of idea that, and have been kind of slowly pushing it out since like 2021 and fall of 2021. Obviously COVID was a big waking up for a lot of people, the government lockdowns. Now I know a lot more and I feel more solid in my foundation for this thesis. But fall 2021, I released the first kind of Bitcoin dollar idea. And I was like, hey, there's actually a lot of evidence that the Bitcoin is going to benefit the United States more than it will benefit anyone else. And that's what's important. At the end of the day, it's like the internet. It doesn't actually matter that DARPA made it necessarily because it is what it is. It's this open protocol that the internet has some control levers and some things that do sort of lean towards the United States with ICANN and certain things, but that's a whole other discussion. But
Mhm.
Bitcoin, it doesn't necessarily matter who made it. What matters is who benefits from it. And so I think that quote that you talked about, where at the beginning here about how this is a technological tool that can be used to empower individuals, that's great. But also the modern state is an individual. It is a corporation. Now there's literally people out here trying to put, Bitcoin on the books of the federal government and basically
Right.
turn the government into a hedge fund, and speculate whether it's with seized funds or taxpayer funds using to buy Bitcoin, or even crazier, selling all of our gold to buy Bitcoin. When you look at something like that, especially the selling the gold aspect, not to get too into macro here, but I think this is an important crux of this. How does the US, why would they do this? Create this neutral internet based protocol that is a deflationary system that sort of takes away, theoretically, the ability for the state to debt pardon because they can't print more Bitcoin. There's a finite supply, right? But in actuality, it actually might create the perfect opportunity for the US government to debt pardon. And when you look at the gold, sorry, go for it.
No, sorry, I was going to say in more than one way, in my opinion, but go ahead.
Of course, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what's been kind of interesting and fun about the Bitcoin dollar thesis is it's evolving in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of ways that they could do it. And one of the ways that's been kind of thrown out there by, senators, Senator Lummis out of Wyoming has written, literature basically waiting to get Trump to get sworn in 7 days or whatever and push this forward. This idea of, let's sell all of our gold. And what that will do is demonetize gold. And then we can use it to set the price of Bitcoin, buy up the price of Bitcoin. All of the, countries around the world that hold gold, now all of a sudden, their gold is demonetized and worth less. The US has a serious debt problem. It has $36 trillion in debt. We're at this point right now where the tax receipts are not nearly enough. We're not getting nearly enough money in from taxes. The interest rate on our debt. So you take out a big loan, you have to pay the interest that doesn't actually go against the principal. You're just paying to service the loan, right? Our just servicing the debt that we have is actually greater than the money we spend on our defense now. And that's a very important axiom when we pass that point. So we're actually paying more to service the dollar than we are to pay for our military, which is supposed to sort of protect our dollar in this, petrodollar system. So if we, demonetize gold, and in an opportunity where normally, we would be able to just say, hey, an ounce of gold is $30,000. We 10x it. We're holding billions of dollars of gold. Now we 10x it and we have enough money in gold, we reset the price in dollars. We can pay off our debt tomorrow. We could do that 100%. But what would happen is every other country that holds gold would then be able to come to the United States and sell gold for 10x the price, and they would be able to get out of all of their debt issues too.
Right. At the expense of,
exactly. So what's very interesting about the Bitcoin play is that the majority of it is in the United States already.
Right.
Significantly through these ties to early Bitcoin having this heavy tie to Silicon Valley, PayPal mafia specifically, maybe even coming out of PayPal. We'll get into that. But there's this ability for the US to basically reprice Bitcoin by buying up a ton of Bitcoin and sort of skipping that debt default scenario, which is what typically happens to world reserve currencies every 300 years is normally the cycle that they get to live for. And we're hitting that right now. And we should be sort of weakening. We should be dealing with our debt problems, and there should be some other superpower coming in to sort of step up and take the place. That's why you hear a lot of talk of de-dollarization, of BRICS, of China and Russia doing their own digital plays, their own gold plays. But if I've learned anything from Vietnam, from Afghanistan, from the petrodollar system created, the US is not going to let the world reserve currency go.
Right.
They don't care if they have to inflate and actually lose the individual purchasing power of the dollar. They don't necessarily care about that. But what they care about is that the dollar is stronger than everyone else's currency.
Right.
And it's the de facto currency that everyone wants to hold and save.
I would simply argue that has to do with foreign policy and more so about the potential globalist technocratic encroachment around the world than their immediate benefit off the financial situation. Like that's what it seems like to me. That's more important to them to be able to financially sanction, for example. Like that's what that would highlight.
Totally. Sure. And again, getting back to the COVID stuff, I think COVID was really, you could argue, a very large misdirection operation where they basically, set us into these two false narratives, which again, I picked one and I'm glad I did, but basically COVID became entirely about pro or anti-vax. And I think there's a lot of issues with the vaccine and all that, and we don't have to get into that here, but really what happened was, in fall of 2019, Larry Fink is meeting with Donald Trump, and they're putting together this plan to do this going direct plan, which is where they printed, trillions of dollars and just handed it right to Wall Street.
Right.
BlackRock really specifically, with absolutely no ability for that stimulus money to go to Main Street at all. And then, of course, 6 months later, they shut down the whole country. gold, oil, Bitcoin, everything completely collapses. Oil literally goes negative, right? There was that sort of famous
Wild.
moment in the second week of March 2020 where gold futures went negative, where, if financial markets were exactly, honest, they were basically saying, we'll pay you $150 to take a barrel of oil from us. Obviously, it's futures market, so it's a little more nuanced than that. But, I'm sort of a 9/11 kid, I'm in my 30s, and, all I've ever known is the US getting into military operations to, perpetuate the petrodollar. And then here, all of a sudden, oil is negative. There's no buyer. Why is that? Why did demand all get crushed? Why did the working class get crushed? Why did gold go down so much? Oil go down so much? The central banks of the world all coordinate and bring interest rates down to zero. And then what happens is Bitcoin 20x's that year. By the end of the year, it goes from being around $3,000 to $60,000. The US raises rates faster than ever, and breaks all the bond curves basically of the world, and create this scenario basically for the US to have an incredibly strong dollar, and also, have this supposedly internet-based neutral asset that's actually predominantly held in the United States wildly appreciate. And obviously, now BlackRock has officially come into Bitcoin. Trump has officially embraced Bitcoin. He wants to be the first Bitcoin president, all this stuff. He lied to us like he does. Everyone always pays attention to his rhetoric and never to his policy.
Right.
And what he did, and he's setting up in his first administration, he brought in Steve Mnuchin, former Goldman, to run the Treasury. And Steve Mnuchin brought in his former One West bank partner, Brian Brooks, to run the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is basically the highest, it's one of the oldest financial institutions in the country. And it's basically the head regulatory position in the US for banks. And so he signs a bulletin that says, banks are allowed to hold crypto assets and specifically stable coins. And he basically sets up this whole precedent for establishing the US as the crypto capital of the world, while Trump is going on Twitter and going on this whole thing about how, hey, I hate Bitcoin. It's trying to fight the dollar. The dollar's king, blah, blah, blah. And everyone is like, oh, my goodness. And Bitcoin sells off and all this stuff. But in reality, his team knew exactly what they were doing. They set up, basically what we're about to see now with him coming in. Bitcoin's at 100K. And we're seeing more regulatory push for, direct action of the US government holding Bitcoin and, all these things. But if you were really paying attention to his policy right before COVID actually happened, which of course he leaves, right, more or less right after, a lot of the severe COVID policy starts, and Biden comes in, becomes basically the fall guy. And now Trump comes in as this rehabilitated hero who's, saving America and using Bitcoin, and literally says, I'm going to cut a little crypto check and pay our $36 trillion in debt. If you were paying attention, he set this all up his first administration while tweeting about how he was doing the opposite. And that's what he does. That's politicians in general, but specifically Trump is, he's a king of misdirection. As much as I think he's, obviously a member of the swamp, but I mean, you got to give him some credit a little bit here for sort of his debt-based, manipulations. That's his whole game. That's what he's always done.
He's a pretty savvy businessman in plenty of ways. I've always given him that credit for sure.
Absolutely.
And as you say, in very dishonest ways. And I just really quickly to point out that time in the first administration, you could clearly argue that was one of the many times that they've undermined it, dropped it, and then scooped up much of the market, more than once to where we are today, and we can get into more of that.
100%. And that's why I think it all started to kind of click for me, as I was sort of sifting through the COVID mess, because COVID was interesting where, I was in Northern California at the time, we were locked down. And then even when lockdowns were over, because I chose to not take a medical treatment, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. So I spent a lot of time just digging and researching and finding out about all this stuff and being like, oh, wow, like Steve Mnuchin should have been prosecuted for what he did in the 2008 crisis at One West, where he worked with Brian Brooks. and he was supposed to go to court in California. Who was the DA at the time? Kamala Harris. She just throws out the court. You just start finding all of these. Oh, wow. There's actually this really large, network of people basically behind, how we got here. And so I argue that the birth of the Bitcoin dollar was basically that week in March of 2020, where they completely imploded the markets. And then again, right, another point here, we pull out of Afghanistan, right after that, which again is sort of to this axiom that maybe we're moving away from the petrodollar system and moving towards this new Bitcoin dollar system. And I'll just quickly explain sort of the petrodollar idea. So money is a technological tool. It's used basically just to express volatility between like two bartering parties. It's you could think of, hey, I have an apple, you have a bike. The guy with the bike is really hungry. He wants to eat the apple. The guy with the apple needs to drive somewhere or go somewhere. So they do a trade. And it makes a lot of sense at first. The guy that eats the apple is feeling good. The guy with the bike is going to his place. But then after, 45 minutes, the guy that now has the apple is stuck there and he needs to get home and he wishes he had his bike. And, the guy that has the bike is now hungry. So there's these variable outcomes that are happening in the barter system that are, can be mitigated. These unwelcomed outcomes can be mitigated by using a technology that, can act as a way to express kind of the volatility between two bartering people that doesn't necessitate a transfer of goods, right? Does that kind of make sense? It's sort of a quick overview, but
or are we touching on no, we're not even getting in cryptocurrency yet. You're simply just talking about
just simply money, right?
Yeah.
But so once you bring in the element of time into barter, then those outcomes start to spread. And then you get the guy that just traded his bike that actually needed it to run his paper route now can't work and all this. So as you get further away from the moment of barter, you start to have more issues with, successful outcomes. So money was basically invented as this way to kind of scale up, human interaction beyond just, localized tribes, really. And there's a lot of economics there of people talking about Dunbar numbers and how you can kind of scale the tribe up from, to more and more. But basically that's the crux of it. Two bartering parties, they're trying to express volatility because they want something else. The money itself isn't necessarily supposed to be valuable. It's just a way to get something that is valuable.
And to be clear for those listening, he's not referring to the fiat dollar today. He's talking about like currency as a historical concept, right? Just so I'm clear. Okay, go ahead.
Exactly. So because those outcomes over time would, really rapidly move away from each other, where one side of the party of the trade would actually, usually end up being in a much better position over time than the other, they decided to tie money to energy because it allows it to be harder to be debased because it's harder to be sourced. So, the old idiom of, money doesn't grow on trees. If money did grow on trees, you could just run out to trees and grab a bunch of money. And then, your currency unit, really devalues really quickly because you can source it very quickly. So gold, develops naturally in many different places around the world, sort of independently as this thing that's really hard to source and takes a lot of energy to pull out of the ground. Obviously, at the time, energy is literally just, pickaxes and people, panning in the river or whatever. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. So the debasement of the currency, takes it's not just pulling leaves off trees. You have to, send people to the mine and get these things in it. So the inflation rate of your currency is now tied to this, basically an energy commodity, that is gold coming out of the ground, because ultimately it's how much energy can you put into getting it out of the ground. So the gold standard kind of becomes, the standard for currency, because it's a really nice way, and that in modern times, 2.5%, 3% gold a year is coming out of the ground that increases the supply by 2 to 3%. In the 70s, the US very infamously goes off the gold standard. This thing called the Nixon shock. There was a whole lot of things that happened before then. Charles de Gaulle coming demanding gold, the London gold pool exploding. Go check out a lot of that stuff. There's a lot of interesting things. The establishment of the Fed, the Bretton Woods Agreement. But basically in the 70s, we go off the gold standard because the issue so they say this was the reasoning behind it. The issue with having a slowly inflating currency based on an energy commodity is that your growth is now limited in your economy to this 2.5–3% of money coming out of the ground. You can't grow your economy more. You can't make more dollars because it's directly tied, 30-1 or whatever ounces of gold to. So your growth is limited.
Yes,
So a bunch of people,
but it is real.
right?
And it exists in the
Exactly,
world.
exactly, exactly. Well, this is their argument, not mine.
No,
Right?
I know. I'm following you. I'm just making a joke.
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny how we're talking about limiting growth, but it's like, well, that's like reality versus virtual reality in my mind. It's ultimately what we're talking about.
Exactly. And that's where fiat, comes from, is sort of this Latin phrase for just like, it is because I declare it to be.
Right.
That's not exactly the Latin, but that concept is just like, it's from a decree that we're just calling it valuable because it's valuable. So the fiat standard really kicks off, worldwide, and in 71 when Nixon takes this off, officially. And so, the US citizens can't, go turn in their dollars for gold anymore. And now we actually have this highly inflationary period in the 70s, where they can just print dollars. There's nothing stopping them from printing dollars because they don't have to meet any sort of arbitrary ratio that's tied to gold. But what happens is that we have a highly inflationary environment. And so your value of your individual purchasing power of your dollar is really rapidly decreasing because they're printing so many more dollars. So what they ended up doing, and you can, this is just, of the record, the US immediately starts going into the Middle East, and doing our imperial thing, and basically establishes this, Kissinger was a really important part of this, but it establishes this relationship with the Saudis and, some other players in the Middle East to basically say, hey, we will give you military support, and protect your refineries, if you make it so that every single person in the world that wants to buy oil, which was a necessity for the 70s, Europe and Asia, if you wanted to industrialize, which everyone wanted to do, you had to compete on the global stage with, these post-war superpowers. The US is so far ahead of everyone else. You want to compete with the US, you need to buy oil to industrialize. It's just a fact. Not that many people are oil rich. So we established this political agreement and say anybody that wants to buy oil has to buy dollars first. So what that does is it creates artificial demand for dollars. So now as we're in the US just printing all these dollars and all these dollars, and the way you actually print dollars is you make these reserve assets that back the dollars, you sell them to private banks, they create dollars in your bank accounts. These reserves now have a buyer, a constant buyer, because everybody that wants to buy oil has to buy dollars first. So Russia, everywhere in the now EU, the Eurozone at the time, all of these countries, they have to buy US dollars first. We have a buyer, and we're able to basically shovel the inflationary effects of printing money, into the Eurozone, and into Asia. And suddenly this, we're able to basically pay our deficits, pay our budgets, service our budget, because we have a buyer of someone that will buy our debt because they need to buy, to buy oil. So that kind of works for a good deal. We're able to sort of get out of this inflationary period a little bit.
Works for the government for sure, but devalues our
Exactly,
currency.
exactly. But the people get really hurt.
Right.
That's sort of the story here. As always, is that the U.S. will do what it takes to, perpetuate empire, and service our debt continually, sort of at the behest of the people that hold dollars. Now, as we're globalizing the dollar, forcing countries around the world to buy dollars, now we're devaluing everyone's money. It's not just the U.S. citizens anymore; it's everybody's. The dollar gets globalized, and we have this huge dollarization trend. And we actually see all of this, in the 80s, is kind of the first time we see this coordinated central banking. We see this thing called the Plaza Accord, which interestingly there was a meeting of the G5 at the time in this hotel in New York, owned by Roy Cohn, interestingly enough. But I'm sure that's not important. And they all come together to basically, make a plan to devalue the yen, or sorry, to devalue the US dollar against the Japanese yen. I believe it was France, the UK, Japan, Yeah, it was the G5 at the time. So this group of then Eurozone, pre-Euro, and they do this coordinated central banking. And the U.S. actually devalues their dollar significantly after raising interest rates incredibly high throughout the inflationary period that they saw in the 70s. The way that you fix inflation is you raise interest rates really, really high. You could look at interest rates as, if we're paying you more money to hold our debt. So the higher the interest rate is, the more you're interested in owning our money. So if interest rates are at 10%, we're paying you 10% to hold our debt over a certain duration. Whereas if rates are 0%, we're paying you 0. So it really changes the whole dynamic of the dollar-based system. It makes lending really, really hard when rates are really high. Anyway, all this stuff is happening. It's the first example of coordinated central banking that happens in 85 at the Plaza Accord. So everyone's on the petrodollar. They're buying dollars to get to oil. We kind of have this good thing cooking. And then the next time in history where we really saw that same issue happen of like, hey, there's a global crisis that could really occur here if we don't get this under control. There's a couple moments a little bit in the 90s where the US did some kind of interesting manipulation stuff to Mexico with NAFTA and a couple of things, but really it was 2008. That was really the next time we saw central bankers sort of looking at each other and being like, oh shit, what's going to happen? This is bad. So of course, 2008, it was all kind of basically taking new financial products that were based on mortgages and turning them into these collateralized debt obligations. And slinging them around in these highly speculative, trading patterns. And then the bubble bursts and, who gets caught holding the bag? It's the homeowners. So again, they devalue and hurt the homeowners, but they bail out the banks and the US empire is fine. The banks are fine. People that own homes across the world are crushed. The stock market's crushed. And then what do we see happen right after 2008? Obviously, we see a split between the party. So Bush leaves, Obama comes in. So the Republicans blame Obama, the Democrats blame Bush. No one learns anything. And then every time. And then in Halloween 2008, some anonymous person releases a white paper on the cypherpunk forums, and it explains the idea of this neutral energy-based asset that lives on the internet. And that's Bitcoin. So Satoshi, this figure, releases it in 2008. And, it kind of chugs along as sort of this, it's just for gamblers. It's just for poker players. It's for pornographers. It's drug dealers. And interestingly enough, I actually, I was in San Francisco, not quite at 2009, but by, 2011, 2012, I was there and I was working in bars and that's what I did for the majority of the time I was there. And a regular at my bar was this guy, Blake Benthal, who actually took over for Ross Ulbricht when he got arrested for running Silk Road. Literally like the next day, Silk Road 2.0 pops up in 2014, and he takes over, kind of being the DPR 2.0, the Dead Pirate Robert, which was the pseudonym that Ross used. Ross was also arrested in San Francisco at the library right near my house, interestingly enough. But so he sets up this, new drug market. And so he actually explained Bitcoin to me in 2014, just as a regular at my bar. He never once explained that there was an element of appreciation or speculation. It was 100% entirely about peer-to-peer anonymous, which it is not anonymous at all, as they all found out because they went to jail, this currency that you could use to buy drugs online on Silk Road. And so I didn't really think too much about Bitcoin. I used it, a couple times around that time, literally not knowing there was a price, somehow not knowing that it was something that could appreciate. But that was the early vibe of Bitcoin. It was really anarchist. It was really, hey, we're circumnavigating payment processors, PayPal, WikiLeaks gets debanked. Let's have them use Bitcoin. There was all this really kind of cool, interesting stuff going on. I wasn't really connected in the scene at all, but that was sort of my primer was, oh, it's this anonymous peer-to-peer cash system. That's pretty cool.
Right.
Then, of course, it gets to 2017, the start of 2017. I see a headline that says Bitcoin crosses, I think it was $1,000, I think at the start of 2017, something around there. And I was like, oh, it can go up. And I really didn't know that there was this speculative sort of commodity element to it. I really literally just thought it was a way you put dollars in, you get, dollar amount out, and then you can send it and buy drugs with it. That's literally what I was taught, because that's what the guy was doing. That was the community. Of course, people understood it earlier on that it was going to be some, there's some pretty infamous price predictions, within the first couple of weeks of Bitcoin coming out, of saying this will be worth millions and yada, yada. But that wasn't really the premise of the community. 2017, it really kicks off and becomes all about speculation. I kind of study it and get kind of swept in, and have been kind of in the Bitcoin space since. And but I think it's really interesting that we see the speculation bubble come at 2017, and then it hits 2020, and we start to see we see this huge bubble explode everywhere in financial markets with the COVID shutdown, and then immediately we see Bitcoin 20x. So there's a couple of things. I know I've been ranting for a while, but there's a couple things. There's a couple of things I want to explain about Bitcoin that's very important in regards to why that change happened.
And please, what you're saying is very important, by the way. Like the background to this really does bring it to a very clear connected point for people that, some of what you're saying I wasn't even aware of, right? This is important stuff. And cool. so please continue.
Thank you. So a very important thing happened that is hardwired into Bitcoin. That was a big reason why Bitcoin changed from being this peer-to-peer, cash-like system into this kind of more of a speculative commodity. And it's not just that it was hijacked by the CIA and a lot of the things that a lot of people perpetuate, kind of infamously in this Roger Ver book, Hijacking Bitcoin. I think there's a few things Roger Ver definitely gets right, and I hope the IRS doesn't fuck with him. But I don't think he's completely right. There's some technical reasons why I don't think he's right. But anyways, going back to one of the things hardwired into Bitcoin is this thing called the halvening. And so we talked earlier about, gold coming out of the ground. It was a good method to not have your currency debased because, it can only come out of the ground, relative to its total supply. 2.5% more supply can come out of the ground. That's only how much we can pull out, right? So there's a cap on growth. So it's a hard money, even though it is inflating. Technically, there's a hard money because inflation is capped. Whereas the dollar system, we have now found out, you can just print $8 trillion in a year and just blow everything up, and it's fine because there's nothing. It's just political. It's fiat. There's nothing, no technology, no math, no sending miners to the ground and hacking. There's nothing that's permitting or preventing the dollar from inflating, other than literally financial action, political action. Bitcoin has a halvening in there. So at the beginning, when Bitcoin was launched at the start of 2009, it was inflating 50% of the total supply that will ever exist in Bitcoin was made in the first 4 years of Bitcoin. So there's this thing called the halvening cycle. So Bitcoin is the blockchain is all these blocks that stack together. It's on average every 10 minutes, every 210,000 blocks. The blocks are these little data sets that have all the transactions in them, but they also issue new Bitcoins. So you've heard of Bitcoin mining. The Bitcoin miners are building blocks, and they are creating new Bitcoin that's issued by the protocol. So in the first 4 years, the first 210,000 blocks, if every 10 minutes, it averages out to about 3.5 to 4 years. In the first 4 years, 50 Bitcoin were mined every block. Bitcoin was worthless when it came out. There was literally no price, but 50 Bitcoin were coming out every 10 minutes. It was a highly inflating currency. 50% of the 21 million that we hear, this hard cap came out in those first 4 years. Every 10 minutes, 50 more Bitcoin, 50 more Bitcoin,
and
50 more
really
Bitcoin.
quickly, for those that are confused, we touched on this a bit in one of the last interviews, as well as some of the things we've discussed. Essentially, the people mining get a reward essentially by solving the cryptographic puzzle for each block, essentially, and the amount they get diminishes over time. And so what you're highlighting there is that the amount that was mined essentially is, that's because there's ultimately a limited amount. Is that what you're getting at? Like in the amount of Bitcoin that's available to mine? Yeah.
Right. So hard coded into the protocol is this asymptotic approach to zero, where it starts at 50% in the first 4 years. And then there was a halvening event. So in 2012 there was a halvening, halvening as in like halving, like cutting in half, and then that block reward goes from 50 to 25. So in those next 4 years, from
25 Bitcoin,
2012,
by the way, right? We're talking
exactly.
about, yeah.
Exactly. So now there's a bit of a price. There's, there's, it's, Bitcoin's worth a few bucks or something. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not always the best historian on Bitcoin sometimes, but 2012 to 2016, 25 Bitcoin are coming out every 10 minutes. So that's a 50% relative reduction of inflation from the previous period. So hard coded into Bitcoin is this idea of we are deflating. It's a disinflationary monetary system, not deflationary yet, disinflationary. So it's at 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes, then it goes to 25. Then the next halving cycle that happens, right at 2020, right when this, Bitcoin dollar system, the COVID stuff is all happening in May 2020 was when the next halving, with the third halving, which would bring it down to, 12 and a half. So the interesting thing about that 12 and a half is relative issuance to the total supply finally brought Bitcoin down to being below the 3% of gold coming out of the ground and below the 2% that the US government is aiming to have Bitcoin. The US government is aiming to have the dollar, like our target inflation is 2%. That's like the Fed's mandate is to hit that 2%. So mathematically, economically, our monetary policy of Bitcoin is getting harder and harder and harder, and less inflation is occurring. So,
And give me the relevance of that in regard to what we're talking about. Is that better or worse for the government and better or worse for the person?
well, what it means is that mathematically, you could argue in 2009 to 2012, Bitcoin is a highly inflating currency. There's not really any reason to value it very much necessarily, unless you're really thinking far ahead, because it's a highly inflating, 50 Bitcoin are coming out every block. There were 10 million Bitcoin made in the first 4 years.
Right.
But then the next 4 years, there was only 5 million. And then after that halving, then it goes down to 2.5. Then it goes to 1.25 million are made. And eventually it goes down and down and down and down. After 32 halvenings, they just round it down and then they just stop issuing new Bitcoin.
Oh, see, that's interesting. I haven't heard that before. I was actually just going to make a point about this, that like a philosophical point, because if you're only ever having something forever, it doesn't ever really go away.
Right.
It's smaller. So there's actually a point where the decision, two questions. There's a point.
Yeah.
Is there a point where that it goes down to zero? And was that
Yes.
part of the original Satoshi white paper plan?
100%.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. Explain that.
There was. So, yeah. So, Ryan's exactly right. It's the whole, frog jumping. If the frog jumps half the distance of the table, how many jumps will it take to reach the end of the table? It will never reach the end of the table. So that's this asymptotic approach to zero. It will continually approach to zero and get as close, but it will never actually technically touch zero. Bitcoin does a funny thing. It's a protocol, right? It's software. So there's a lot of, numbers that generally are used in software just because of the way that, bits and bytes work. And 32 is one of the more used, software numbers because it's a really nice even bit. 32 bits basically. So it's a terrible explanation, but I hope that makes sense. It's a number that was chosen because it sort of makes sense. It's easy to code that there's this nice mathematical, okay, right at 32, we just cut the tail off. In the 32 happening, in the 32nd epoch, they call them, where we're in the final stage where there is technically issuance, but very, very little. It is so far below a Bitcoin. It's like 0.001. It's barely a tenth of a Bitcoin or something, not even. That comes out every block. So it's very, 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 very small. So as that halvening happens and goes and goes and goes, it gets so close to zero. Satoshi made a decision at 32. We'll just cut it. When we hit the 33rd epoch, we go to zero. And then Bitcoin will sustain itself entirely from financial transaction fees. So miners, instead of getting new Bitcoin issued, they will just get the fees of people trying to put their transactions in blocks.
Interesting. Well,
So
how does that work though for the miners who are involved with the actual CPU powered mining operations who may not, unless I'm misunderstanding something, be involved with the actual transactional aspect of it? How would they make revenue from just
sure.
mining? How does that work once that goes down to zero?
Well, actually, very soon, in the next 8 years or so, maybe 12 years, I mean, I would certainly argue that that will probably happen already.
Mm-hmm.
Where, there's a thing called the block reward, which when Bitcoin started, it was 50, then it was 25, then it was 12 and a half. Now it's 6.15.
That's what we were
That
referring to. That's what I was saying before about the prize for kind of solving the cryptographic
exactly.
puzzle for each block. Good.
Exactly. But as that shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, the amount of transactions that are going in the block, if you want to send a Bitcoin transaction, what you're basically doing is trying to hail like a taxi. Like you're like, hey, miner, put me in the block, put me in the next block. The block size is limited, right?
Mm-hmm.
So each block, every 10 minutes, a new block is added, is around, 2 to 4 megabytes, kind of depending on how you look at it. Technically, it's a megabyte. They
Right.
introduced these new weight units. It's this whole thing. We don't need to get into that. But basically, there's a limit to how many transactions you can fit in a block. So if you want to make sure that you get in the next block, because it's very important for you to
I
make this
see.
transaction, you
Region.
pay a higher fee.
Got it.
So as you pay higher fees, you basically are bribing the miners.
Man, that seems
Yeah.
wildly complicated. I can see so many ways in which that screws up the entire process. Like where
Hmm.
you maybe, like eventually if people start, because I had an issue a while back, and this is not really the point of today's conversation, but where I got kind of stalled in trying to cash something out because the fee was low and it
Hmm.
was everybody was going higher than it. And it just kind of
Right.
continued that way for almost like a month. And I was like,
Hmm.
and it just I'd have somebody actually help me fix that. And so if
Yep.
hypothetically you get to a point to where people are bidding above it, it just caused complications for like the actual transactional aspect of it. Because this is where it gets into the point of whether this was, this is so far away from the original vision of peer-to-peer without a financial institution now to the point to where it necessitates those things. Like you have to have this coordinated financial middleman, or arguably. Anyway, the point is just
Hmm.
that seems wildly more complicated to me. Do you see that as let me ask it like this. Do you think, how did Satoshi see that going forward, especially if the mindset, again, under the guise that, or I guess considering this as maybe not an origin point from the government or however you want to see it, designed in a way hypothetically that was meant to circumvent financial transactions or financial institutions rather, how did he see that going forward after that point? Because it seems like you need something like that, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, well, I think the idea was either Bitcoin is going to be worth a lot of money and people are going to want to transact and settle on it, or
Mm-hmm.
they're not. So either there's going to be a user base that are transacting, and if that's true, then those users will sustain the miners by paying them enough that you are actually encouraged to stay in the system. There's a lot of debate about this.
Yeah.
There are people that are hardcore Bitcoiners that think Bcash is stupid and BSV is stupid, and they think that there's still an issue here. There are hardcore Bitcoiners that think we should add some things called tail emissions, where we actually add, a slight reward at the end of the protocol, where it's just a, hey, there's 0.01 Bitcoin gets awarded every
Mm-hmm.
block still or whatever, and technically the supply inflates, but it relatively it is still deflationary or disinflationary, because relative to the supply, if you're adding a stable amount to the end, your supply is getting bigger, your amount staying the same, the percentage wise is shrinking. So there's this sort of tail emissions idea. There's a
Interesting.
privacy coin called the Monero that's decently
Mm-hmm.
popular, even with some Bitcoiners, although they won't tell you that, that uses tail emissions.
Interesting.
It's very controversial, though. There's also this idea of demiurge, where they actually take coins that have been sitting in wallets that haven't moved in
Ooh,
15 years, and then they
that's
start
weird.
to break those down. And I disagree with that
Yeah.
entirely.
Yeah.
But again, this is also a really good point here to break and say this is an experiment.
Yeah.
This really is an experiment. So there's a lot of people that should experiment and try different things, right?
Well,
So that's where you get the Bcash element and the BSV element. Bcash says, hey, Bitcoin's supposed to be a peer-to-peer. It's the first line in the white paper. Why do we have a tiny block size that makes it harder for Bitcoiners to spend and have cheap transactions? what is actually truly world changing about this is we can do Bitcoin transactions that don't require a trusted third party, and so let's increase the block size, but we'll increase it but limit it, right?
And that was the original vision from Satoshi's original white paper.
Well, that's what the Bcashers say. Everyone is trying to sell something, right? That's the thing that's really hard about this, is that everybody has their bags and they have things. So, but that's what they claim, right? But then the Bcashers split off again.
Right.
And then the Satoshi visioners come in and they say, no. Satoshi actually never wanted to have a block size at all. Let's have dynamic blocks that the size is only limited by the amount of people that want to transact at that moment. So fees will basically be zero forever, right? So there's a fork that occurs where, the Bcashers go to, I forget exactly, maybe like 5 megabytes or something. And then BSV comes in and forks off that, and they go infinite blocks, and we can go huge, right?
Yeah. Which can rival Visa, as far as I understand it, if you really wanted to implement it in a real transactional process.
Yes, but there's an issue with it, which is the thing that's interesting about Bitcoin is that you can run a node by myself. I can run one, and I can validate all the way back to the first block that has ever existed. And I can, with a Raspberry Pi and very soon with a smartphone, verify every single transaction with 100% fidelity back to the very, very, very beginning. And I don't have to trust a single fucking person.
Right.
And I can look at every single transaction and every single block, and I can send a block or send a transaction and put it in the next block. And I don't have to worry about a single point of failure, because I can do it on a tiny bandwidth cell phone service plan with a tiny hard drive and a really shitty computer, a really bad CPU. And I can process all of these tiny 1 megabyte blocks, and I can process all of them back, all the 800,000 blocks or whatever, go all the way back to Genesis with complete fidelity. And I don't have to trust an internet service provider. I don't have to trust basically complicated hardware. I don't have to have a really awesome computer. And so you have this sort of, anybody with a smartphone, basically, or slightly better than today's modern cell phones, can validate and run their own node and don't have to worry about anyone when they want to make a transaction. As you increase the block size, that's no longer as true.
Yeah.
Because you now have to have, if say like a BSV, every block is a gigabyte, you have to store every single block. 800,000 blocks that are a gigabyte big is a humongous strain on hardware, and probably more importantly, bandwidth, because you have to download an insane amount of gigabytes every day. That is not necessarily something that an individual can do, right? So when you increase the block size, you actually create more opportunities for centralization, because who actually has a super fucking computer that can crush and validate gigabyte blocks and download them every 10 minutes? A very small amount of people. So the BSV blockchain has a very small amount of validation sets. There's a very small amount of nodes that can actually do it. Bcash as well. It's a little bit easier, but still pretty bad. Bitcoin has a ton of nodes. It's very easy to validate. And now, again, it's an experiment. It's a choice. I understand why people are interested in exploring that. But I think that those centralization points, especially bandwidth, are absolutely worth talking about. And I think that people kind of skate over these things when they talk about BSV, because they're like, well, we can compete with Visa. Sure, you can, but you're centralized like Visa when you do it.
Well,
because blockchains are clunky and they suck. They're really shitty technology on purpose. Like, it's a really difficult thing to create a blockchain. It's slow. It's kind of slow on purpose, because you want to have this this distributed, decentralized, immutable chain of data that can't be rolled back. It's a bearer asset. No one can just come in and mess around with the no party can kind of come in and centralize the protocol. Now, that said, there's still a lot of issues with small blocks, but I get why Bitcoin has stayed with that. And then I want to say one more thing before you jump in. I'm sorry, but there was this block size war that was fought in 2017, where these issues of, hey, we're kind of starting to hit, where it's kind of hard to get transactions in blocks. we're looking ahead and we're seeing that we're going to have this choke point of throughput. So how do we maximize throughput? So they established this thing called the Lightning Network that allows you basically to create a payment channel between two people, and then you can infinitely send transactions back and forth, and then you can close it when you want, and you can trustlessly close back to the main layer, and it gives you this transactional throughput that's almost literally infinite within the channel. But then, of course, there's still a lot of issues of, well, you still have to send a transaction to open the channel and then send one to close. So if there's a huge, the bottlenecks of traffic, it can still be really expensive and have a lot of issues. Lightning has some issues, but it's still very interesting. In the block size war, they came, there was a whole bunch of people that got together. There were all these closed doors meetings and all these businesses, and the miners were one group, and some businesses were another group, and all these kind of factions came together. But the thing that's lost is that people think that it was small blockers and then big blockers, but in reality it was big blockers and bigger blockers, because what ended up happening is we did raise the block size. Right. Objectively on Bitcoin BTC, the block size did increase with the SegWit soft fork. So the block sizes or increases are the only provable way we know to really scale blockchains, and BTC has done that themselves. So I'm not ruling out that there might not ever be a block size increase in the future, as Moore's law kind of hits, and the idea that the cheapness of storage space and of computation space, it gets more efficient and more and cheaper. So you can now buy like a 3 terabyte like micro SD card. I mean, it's insane what you can do now for like not that much. As that continues to happen, as bandwidth throughput continues to increase on the whole, whether it's through satellites or broadband, fiber optic, we might end up seeing a block size increase, because it wouldn't actually cause a centralization, choke point, because the technology that is dispersed around the world with ISPs and with hardware providers is at a certain point where it's okay. So we could see that. Now there are also people in Bitcoin that argue, let's lower blocks so we can transact with ham radios. I mean, it's an experiment.
It's a philosophical thing. This is so fascinating to me. Like, it comes down to the idea of what you truly believe this is meant to do, even amongst the people that are really of the mind of the origin peer-to-peer transaction with no financial institution. There's even deviations within that community about, like 100%. For example, especially today where as I think you've covered, where it intersects with the Trump administration conversation, where you got people that are saying, no, let's use this and just digital gold. Let's just hold it forever. It's, and that directly kind of contradicts the main point of how this system was meant to work. But the system was never meant to be like, you have to transact. It's just that you could, but so it's like an interesting deviation between the two. But to the point you're making, like you made excellent points right there. And the more I learned about this, the more I completely, and I already did when I first stepped into it, but day by day, you see why this becomes so contentious. Like, there's so many deviations, and so many different points.
Billions and billions of dollars behind the choices. I mean, that's the thing that really colors a lot of this philosophy. Because I agree, it is philosophical. It's also technical, but it's also economic and investing and speculative. And, there's people that have put huge amounts of money behind one fork or the other. There are people that have lost tons of money supporting one and not the other. So anytime you have a philosophical conversation about an experiment, and then there's billions, if not trillions of dollars involved, I mean, it's very hard to know. For sure. And I think this digital gold argument is really interesting, because this is where I have now kind of formally split myself from where I'm like, I don't think Bitcoin was hijacked at all. I think it was designed to do exactly this, and it was designed and it was released exactly at this moment. I mean, we did a very abridged, the Goodwin abridged economic history from 71 to 2008, but this idea that it just pops off in 08, after, the US has this huge, mortgage crisis that basically spills out into everywhere. It's hard for me to think that that's just an accident. And then now that we're seeing this huge pivot, I think Trump is very obviously this sort of, he's a Trojan horse kind of candidate himself, where people just sort of, ideologically you're like, oh, that's my guy. We got, but then he's ushering in, I think, this technocracy at a rate faster than, anyone has done in the past. And so I think when you look at how Bitcoin has now become an essential part of his platform and his answer for solving the biggest issue that the US empire faces, which is its debt problem. And he has created a narrative that, these Bitcoiners that were all about end the Fed are now literally saying, mend the Fed.
Right.
Let's fix the US debt problem with Bitcoin. Let's cheer that BlackRock is pumping our bags. And a lot of I think the ethos of the community was hijacked, but I don't think the protocol was. I think that deflationary, disinflationary monetary policy, it was supposed to become this asset, this neutral asset that we could use, that we could inflate the dollar into while we hold all the Bitcoin, and then we become the Bitcoin winners of the world, and we basically extend our hegemon another 300 years, maybe even longer, at the most important technological axiom, crux, whatever moment in history, as AI and all of these things are popping off. It's like, I don't believe in multipolarity anymore, really, after COVID. I really think that we are in a one world empire context, unfortunately. And I think the US Silicon Valley tech oligarchs are that group. They run the Trump administration. Frankly, I hope I can say that. And yeah, sure. And
I definitely agree.
And Bitcoin came out of that group, I think. I'm sure a lot of people would disagree, but I think that it's very clear when you look at the primordial goop that Bitcoin came out of. These guys are very clever. They knew to release it with Silk Road. They knew to release it with the poker players and have it come out in this way that made it seem this total anarchist, drug dealer, pornographer kind of thing, criminal thing. And then, 14 years later or whatever, it's solving the US's debt problem. Like, I don't think that's the US. If it was really a threat to the United States empire, there's no way they would just literally be assassinating people. They would be doing much more extreme things. They'd be flexing more levers that they have over the supply chain of hardware and over their internet service providers. Who owns all of the fiber optic cables under the ocean? It's Facebook, it's Google, it's Amazon, it's Microsoft, it's Silicon Valley. They have an entire they surround Africa with fiber optic cables. Who owns all the satellites? It's the same group of people. If they really wanted to, make it really hard to use Bitcoin, they would. And they wouldn't just use lawfare. They would do other things. And I think that the fact that they haven't really done that is another feather in the cap of, well, maybe this is to their advantage. And if they're really going to start buying millions of Bitcoin, and not millions of dollars, but millions of Bitcoin, and selling gold to do that, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that I don't think there's no way they just woke up and went, hey, we can use this. This is good for us. No, I think they created it.
I tend to lean. I mean, it's hard because I agree. Everything you're saying is completely accurate. It's like, well, I get what the picture where you've laid out really well, is that clearly it is still, even with what you're highlighting, something that almost seems to, in a way, which we'll get into, I think, next, undermine what they seem to be building. But as you highlight very well in your chain series, as these two things that seem to be different come together, it very much creates this like new monetary system, which is that, as you highlighted very well, from Trump's administration forward, or even before that, it seems very coordinated with the very people that seem to be pretending to fight back right now, which, that's where I was really getting. The philosophical part of this is so important, because as you're highlighting, like, let's just even say, for sake of conversation, and we'll get into next, like the whole PayPal overlap and what you're highlighting right there, is that this is clearly something that is, if not the very beginning, has immediately been used and hijacked and manipulated, the size and everything, to keep it in a place that would lead to this point. And so it's very easy to kind of just throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? But it's clear to see, like with the blockchain, the forks with Bitcoin Cash and BSV, and the differences between all of them, it feels in a way like each one is striving in its own way to try to meet that. But I get the sense that, like, Bitcoin BTC itself is ultimately the least close to that mindset. But at the same time, you pointed out that there are different aspects of it that could benefit in other ways. And, so at the end of the day, it's kind of the same ultimate point. And so, I mean, at first I felt, again, BSV being Bitcoin Satoshi vision. So clearly they feel like that's the original idea. But as you highlighted, the idea of the lack rather more centralization potential. As you highlighted after that, though, is like we seem to be rapidly inclining again in a technological direction that I'm afraid of, but where, moments ago we had little flip phones, and now we have phones that have more capacity than we went to the moon with, in that conversation.
Sure,
but the point being clearly that we may very shortly be able to do that. And so it's just so convoluted. And so I want people to walk away with this, at the very least, perhaps so far, with the idea that, the same idea here is that it seems to be without question being utilized by the government. Wonder whether it started that way, as we'll go into next. But please do not think as even like Monero, for example, there are ways that it seems that we could start to fight back on this. And I think that's very important.
And I just want to jump off that really quick before we get into the PayPal stuff, is that you are 100% correct. Again, this is an experiment. I like to look at it as a game. I think finances, financial systems are games. If you look at John Nash's kind of work that he was doing at Princeton, you look at von Neumann, who's supposed to be running the Manhattan Project, is releasing books at the height of the Manhattan Project about game theory via the Princeton Press that sort of established a lot of the sort of idea of, that grew into the game theory, field of study. All coming out of America, by the way. But all these people kind of coalesce into Princeton. Albert Einstein's there, Neumann's there, Nash is there, and they start working on all of these, game theoretical, works. And John Nash specifically, had done a lot of work on things that you could really directly could connect to Bitcoin, which I think is very fascinating. And that's sort of its own chestnut there. But I think the idea that it's still a game and it's still being played is the important thing that we need to remember here, because the US government can only use Bitcoin to debt pardon and only use it to extend empire in very specific ways. If Bitcoin becomes a way that becomes a protocol that we sort of can encourage, it doesn't necessarily have to be transactional throughput. We don't need to spend Bitcoin every day to buy our coffees and all these things. I don't think we necessarily need to do that. We can use other protocols to do that. But if we can still monetize Bitcoin and maximize the amount of people that can hold Bitcoin, that's really the issue of the throughput to me, is that if there was all the reason in the world, if there was currency failure, mass currency failure across the world, and billions of people wanted to come to Bitcoin, they wouldn't be able to tomorrow.
Right.
They wouldn't be able to hold their own coins without a trusted third party, because there are limited amount of transactions that can go in a block. If you want to onboard 8 billion people onto Bitcoin, you damn well better have some really clever ways to do it, because maximizing block space is very difficult. So the way that the Bitcoin system is set up right now is there are these things called stable coins that basically work as the liquid money market, the transactional money market for Bitcoin, for people to trade, for people to transact in. And so these stable coins, which are very importantly backed by US debt, treasuries, they are the fastest growing market for US debt. They are rapidly outpacing national buyers of US debt in these things called T-bills, treasury bills, basically securitized debt that the US government sells that backs dollars. Things like Tether now have $150 billion of debt. They've only been around for a few years. They only crossed $10 billion of debt in 2020. Now they have 150 plus billion. For reference, China and Japan historically are two largest debtors, or creditors rather. They have, just under a trillion, just under $1 trillion in debt. So already Tether, this tiny firm that has like 50 employees, basically has, over a tenth of the share of the largest nation state that holds our debt. Howard Lutnick, who's the incoming commerce secretary, owns a percentage of Tether. We're seeing, a possibility basically that not only is Bitcoin basically this Trojan horse for the new petrodollar system, we create this Bitcoin dollar system where rather than forcing people to buy dollars to buy oil, we force them to buy dollars to use Bitcoin. Right. Tether is sort of, it's called Tether. Come on. But Tether is basically this mechanism that allows the petrodollar to evolve into the Bitcoin dollar. And when we saw in March 2020, 6 weeks before there's another halving and Bitcoin, its relative issuance goes below the dollar, 2% target inflation rate, goes below gold coming out of the ground. We see COVID happen. We see oil go negative. We see Bitcoin go to $3,000 at 20x's that year. The stablecoin market explodes. It goes crazy. They tack on $140 billion of treasuries, in the last 4.5 years. They're now, I think it's like, I don't know. It's crazy. They're so far up in like their gobbling up of treasuries. It's well past almost every nation state in the world, which is typically who you would think you would sell your debt to. Now we're selling it to like little tech firms. And so if we don't allow Bitcoin to become something that billions of people can hold, we are going to see people get forced onto these systems where they are centralized. They do have blacklist capabilities. The CIA, the Secret Service, private versions of the CIA, like Chain Analysis, which was funded by Incutel, which is the CIA's venture capital firm, are all onboarded onto Tether's system. So they can seize and surveil these private issued government backed dollar stable coins that are on public blockchains. It's the worst of all worlds for us. It is the CBDC. We are all so afraid of CBDCs coming from the government because why? Because we're afraid of programmability, surveillability, and seizability. Well, guess the fuck what? It's that, but worse, because it's private entities. They don't have constitutional protection saying you can't do this to a person. They're private companies. They can do whatever they want. No shoes, no shirt, no service. They can do whatever they want. So I think that there's this sort of sly roundabout way that they've created this Bitcoin dollar system where if we don't push Bitcoin to allow it to be something that can service billions of people, who does it actually service and who does it empower? To bring this back to the top of the conversation, it empowers the U.S. empire. And it has now become a way for us to service our meaning the U.S. government. Not that I really identify as a U.S. government member, but hey, the U.S. government is allowed to service their debt by the stable coins buying up, all of these treasuries. So if Bitcoin goes to be $100 trillion market, and then we have 10% of that, 20% of that being met in treasury demand from stablecoin providers, because that's how you make it liquid. That's how you transact with Bitcoin. There we go. We've got $20 trillion. We've basically solved our debt crisis by selling it to this one tech firm. Then you go to look at the tech firm. Perfect transition into PayPal. Then you get to look into the Tether firm and you look at these people and they have incredible connections to the incoming Trump administration and the PayPal mafia. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Well, no, I mean that's pretty much where we're going to go next is this point. But so what's interesting is, so I think, the background of Tether is connected to this very conversation. I was kind of just going to get into briefly about, what does you think is kind of the background of Tether? Because I don't believe that this is some like same with like the Bitcoin point. Like I believe there's more going on around these things than just a company that starts up to try to make some money, And so I think in this case, as you mentioned, Dr. John Nash, going back to the 50s and 60s, it looks like, and the conversation of that through, like you said, like game theory and like the conversation throughout using, I guess, as he frames in this bad money versus even like an interesting reference to like the Keynesian conversation, like this like Malthusian mindset. It's very interesting. You guys could read through that, but this will be a 5-hour interview if we go through all. So I think it's important
for sure.
To start with the PayPal point, go ahead and I'll just briefly lay it out so that explain, how PayPal in your research is connected to Bitcoin, BTC, and how Tether plays a role in that, ties to Peter Thiel and the current Trump administration. So it's a great thread. I'll include in the show notes, by the way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think, the John Nash is its own podcast on its own, and I think it's extremely interesting. And just to leave a breadcrumb for everybody, he's a little bit of a difficult person sometimes, but there's an incredible writer who I think is one of the best economists and writers and thinkers in the Bitcoin space. He goes by Jal. His handle is Soker_Patoshi. And he has basically written out this sort of, he's really set the standard for the Nashian view of Satoshi. Whether or not he is John Nash is sort of irrelevant, and I think he would say that himself, but he really establishes where all of these points that Bitcoin draws from really can draw back down to Nash and his work with the Rand Corporation and the NSA and his work at Princeton. So I highly recommend checking out his stuff. and then just read Nash. I think Nash is one of the most, it's scary to read game theory and mathematical stuff because you think it's going to be really difficult. He's so smart that you're able to read it and it's very accessible. So I highly recommend checking that out. There's some links obviously in this thread. But then we get to this Bitcoin dollar system. And so what I found, really interesting, I got I got a nice tip from Stavrola Pabst, who has written for Unlimited Hangout before, a great researcher and writer who's done a lot of work on Palantir and sort of the incoming technocracy state. And she gave me a sort of, knew I was writing the Chain series and gave me basically a tip of like, well, have you ever looked into like the really early PayPal stuff, like what they were trying to do? And, I've always been very, well, not always, but since looking at a lot of the stuff the last few years, I've been very wary of Peter Thiel and the PayPal mafia, but I hadn't really looked into early PayPal history. And I read this book. I actually have it right here. I will show this guy, Eric Jackson. He was an early marketing employee at PayPal, and he wrote this book called The PayPal Wars. That's a book that just explains kind of the foundation of the formation of PayPal. And in it, he talks about this meeting that he had as soon as he got hired. And Thiel, calls the group together. There's like 20 of them at that point, and he calls the group together and he explains why PayPal, like what PayPal is going to do. And what he says is that we're going to establish this new world currency. And the way we're going to do it is we are going to allow people across the world using the internet and the digitalization of the dollar to give citizens of the world, of other nation states, the ability to opt out of their national local currency, which is, hyperinflating or, having all of these issues, debanking issues. Will allow them with an internet connection to have access to the US dollar system. And we're going to it's going to be this altruistic, amazing thing where we're going to, for the first time ever, give the citizens of the world financial freedom by using a centralized US dollar, right? I mean, it's totally insane when you really think about it.
Yeah.
But there was this idea of, hey, this is an altruistic thing we're doing. And yeah, we're going to make a shit ton of money, but really we're here to save the world from fiat currency, which is so bad and is waging hell on all of these people. Well, the dollar is fiat, obviously, and PayPal is the centralized system where they can seize your funds. And when you peel back a little bit more of the foundation of PayPal, Max Levchin did this very illuminating talk with Charlie Rose where he says, when I was making PayPal, I worked with every 3- and 4-letter agency, and they were some of the most fruitful business partnerships I ever had. So really started digging into early PayPal, but immediately from that meeting that is talked about in this Eric Jackson book, I realized how similar that was actually to the proposition of Tether. And this is something that the stablecoin issuers say, that they're like, hey, any of your criticisms about Tether are just your financial privilege showing, and people around the world want dollars because it's the best currency. And you're in Argentina and you're going to tell an Argentine that they don't want to have dollars because the US empire is bad or blah, blah, blah. Like, how dare you? It's kind of the same argument.
Right.
This idea that dollarizing the world is like an altruistic good because we're allowing people to be onboarded to US banking systems and use the dollar. Well, I reject that premise entirely. I don't think it's unbanking the banked. I think you're charging the citizens of the world a fee to use your bank account that you just onboarded the CIA and the NSA and the Secret Service and chain analysis on, and you can seize their money at any point. And it's not like the dollar isn't debasing rapidly too. So what are we talking about here? Right. So I noticed this really crazy parallel between early PayPal and this idea of creating a new world currency, and got this great hint from Stavrola to look at this. So I did, and I dug more into the founders of Tether, specifically this guy, Brock Pierce, who's kind of this infamous figure who, he has a really dirty history. He was the youngest member of this group of three guys that started the Digital Entertainment Network, which you guys might have heard. I believe there was a pretty famous documentary about it, like The Secret or The Open Secret or something that about kind of Hollywood pedophilia and abuse cases. And so these three guys, this older gentleman, Mark Collins Rector, his basically groomed boyfriend, Chad Shackley, and then Brock Pierce, who was this former Disney star. He was in Mighty Ducks 2 and the first kid or whatever was Sinbad and some of these early Disney movies. He like moved into this mansion with them, and they started this early streaming website before there was broadband and any of these things, invested in by Microsoft. There was an Enron connection, all of these kind of strange, weird connections. But the older two gentlemen ended up getting arrested for abuse and huge stashes of child porn and a lot of things. And Brock was implicated in some of it as well. He managed to sort of escape the stink of that. And when he was basically in his, not in jail, but sort of under, house arrest, basically, he got really into online gaming, really into like EverQuest and World of Warcraft. And he ended up starting a new company called the Internet Gaming. The IGE is what it's called, Internet Gaming Entertainment, or I'm not Exchange, I think is what it was, Exchange. And so he created sort of the first, well-known and successful digital assets, digital goods market, where he was selling gold from World of Warcraft and from EverQuest for real money and goods and items. So him and his crew basically created this ability to farm, get people to work for them and play hours into this game, kind of like Bitcoin mining, and have these people mining and mining gold in Warcraft and establishing these huge amounts of in-game currency and then selling it for real dollars. So what happens is he's really young when he establishes this. Steve Bannon of Goldman comes in and buys up the company and becomes the CEO of the company and becomes Brock's right-hand man, basically. And they establish this kind of empire in the digital asset space. And interestingly enough, he becomes the largest merchant on PayPal for 3 years. And while working there, he's on the PayPal advisory board, and he actually gets PayPal to develop. So this is early 2000s. He gets them to develop right after they went public. They sold to eBay in 2004. So around like 2000 to 2004, this is that era. And he gets them in those 3 years to develop what's called Project IGE, which ends up being their credit card processing system. So he's heavily connected with PayPal, again, their largest merchant for 3 years. So they know damn well what's going on. The Goldman is in there, which Goldman is a heavily associated intelligence, speculation firm. And obviously Bannon has huge connections to Trump administration and Cambridge Analytica and through Facebook and a lot of other things. But he establishes this kind of chokehold on the digital asset space and becomes really connected with PayPal. Ends up starting in a digital gaming venture firm called Clearstone Gaming. Clearstone is actually a spinoff of an incubator in California called ID Labs that was started by Bill Gross and this guy, Bill Elkis, who were the first institutional investors in PayPal. Interestingly enough, Bill Elkis was also a trustee of the J. Epstein Foundation. But again, that's a conversation for another time. Brock Pierce ends up becoming this really important player in the digital asset space before Bitcoin happens. As the years go, Bitcoin happens. And he happens to be one of the first Bitcoin evangelists and happens to be someone who gets connected to Bitcoin before it has a price even, basically, in the 2010, 2011. At the same time, he's going to the Mind, conference with Epstein and, is connected to a lot of these currency speculators, which Thiel was. The real first investor of PayPal was Thiel himself from Thiel Capital, taking, I think it was like $100,000 from his currency speculating that he was doing at Stanford. Stanford, of course, was one of the members of this MDDS group, which was where the CIA and the NSA and DARPA were funding They funded Page and Brin to start Google, and so Stanford was a part of this group. All of this stuff is kind of kicking off, and the digital asset space is really popping off. And Brock comes out basically as one of the early Bitcoin evangelists, and very quickly on comes up with this idea for creating other assets to exist on Bitcoin. So he does this thing called Mastercoin, which ends up developing into Tether. And him and a couple other guys, one of the guys is Craig Sellers, who is sort of the CTO, the technician. I generally think he's a pretty cool guy. I think he's okay. I like his takes. He seems to sort of understand the stakes here. But some of the other guys in there, William Quigley, who was connected with Clearstone, and some others, not so great. And they ended up establishing Tether. So kind of even before Bitcoin is really monetized at all, the first real pump of Bitcoin where it really kind of got monetized and people paid attention was in the 2013, 2014, which is right when Tether comes out. And they established the first dollar stable coin. And it is actually literally runs on Bitcoin at first. It runs on this thing called the Omni layer. So within the blocks, there was such little transactional output on Bitcoin because there was 10,000 people using it, that they were able to put other assets within the ledger basically of Bitcoin. They could store other assets in there. You can still do that, but it's harder because there's a lot more competition for block space. But at the time, they were able to basically bootstrap a digital dollar right on Bitcoin itself. And this is a company that Brock Pierce starts. Again, I think Tether was another one of those. Let's sort of, it's a infamously hated business where it is routinely, made fun of for not having audits, routinely, being referred to as money for human traffickers and launderers, and it's Chinese real estate paper, and they've never passed a formal audit, and the Wall Street Journal, and just New York Times, just everybody is always sort of attacking Tether for saying that they're not legitimate and they're going to pop at any moment. And once they do, Bitcoin is going to collapse. And they've been supporting Bitcoin because every time Bitcoin goes down, they print a couple $1 million of Tether and pump the price of Bitcoin back up. And that's been this gambit for a decade now, right? That Tether is going to implode. Once it does, Bitcoin implodes. But what actually happened? The largest primary dealer for the New York Fed, Cantor Fitzgerald, which was started, actually not started, but the most important person in the company's history who's run the company essentially the entire time, Howard Lutnick, the incoming Commerce Secretary, runs this primary dealer, Cantor Fitzgerald. They're the largest trader of U.S. debt in the world, in the U.S. anyway. It turns out that they are holding all of the paper behind Tether. And not only are they in the most legit place custody that they could in the entire world, he owns a stake of the business. And now they're coming in with this amazing opportunity to basically, get any legal action that had been taken against them, or they can be basically re-domiciled into the regulatory arm of the United States, due to this political coziness with the incoming trend. So they painted this incredible picture that Tether was this incredibly fraudulent operation. But now they're crucial and critical to the survival of the U.S. debt system.
It's similar to the way they dealt with Bitcoin, right? Where they, up until the moment it was clear it was going to become the thing, we were all being told by those same people that it was a bubble, that it wasn't real, and it's this same dynamic. That's important.
Exactly. And so when you see these things happen in parallel, and you see that literally PayPal wanted to create a new world currency, they come out and say, Bitcoin survived or successfully created a new world currency where we failed. That's a quote from David Sachs. Guess what? He's the incoming AI and crypto czar for Donald Trump. He was the first product manager or I think product manager of PayPal, COO, excuse me. Yeah. So, he's now one of the most important people theoretically in the government for setting the policy here.
For,
And
for both crypto and artificial intelligence, by the way. That's
exactly.
important.
Exactly. And so there's a lot to get into with the chain series. And again, that's a whole other chestnut, and we don't have time for that. But you look at that there was this sleight of hand, this misdirection of Bitcoin specifically, and then of Tether, of this, Trump is coming out there being like, you will never get a CBDC under me. And all the little seals are clapping in the front row, being like, yeah, hell yeah. But what is he doing? He's pushing private bank issued stable coins, which again, we've already covered, are just as programmable, surveillable, seizable, and actually worse than if it was directly a government, arguably, because constitutional protections don't exist. So we're seeing this total PayPal mafia takeover of the incoming government. And there's this weird sort of dynamic where, the US intelligence, community basically went into Silicon Valley and established the internet, established PayPal, Facebook, Google. Now they're coming back to roost, to Pennsylvania Avenue. And these people have billions, if not trillions of dollars of reasons to promote Bitcoin and Tether. Or what I think is really going to happen with stable coins is PayPal just released their own stable coin that was issued by this issuer, Paxos. It's a very interesting company, but they're going to do their own stable coin. So what I think is going to happen is we're going to see banks and these fintech firms, but really banks, adopt stable coins as the underlying currency of their whole financial system, internally. So we're going to see Bank of America and Wells Fargo and JP Morgan, all of these banks have cryptocurrency, plays here, right? They're all doing their own little private things, whether it's a fork of Ethereum or whatever, but all these banks are going to issue stable coins. We're going to see all these private banks come in and do stable coins. I think ultimately Tether probably won't be the biggest one, but they certainly set the standard and quite literally tethered Bitcoin to the US dollar system, and perhaps fatally so. Not that Bitcoin will collapse, quite the opposite, but probably prevented in a lot of ways. A lot of the social capital and just literal capital is now going into developing Bitcoin-based stable coins and how do we get dollar instruments on Bitcoin. And that's sort of just seen as the way to scale Bitcoin rather than scaling Bitcoin itself. So if they're successful in that operation, basically, then I think the US has found a way to pay off their debt, a way to create a CBDC in effect without creating a CBDC and dealing with that headache, and find a way basically to extend hegemon while other countries scramble to buy up Bitcoin and infrastructure to mine Bitcoin and have some sort of say in the validation of transactions on the network. So when I really look at it really zoomed out, I mean, I think the US government played one of the best misdirections possible, and are really set up to dominate, again, the most important sort of technical evolution, that we certainly will see in our lifetime. I think it's an important time, having just said that, to sort of, well, does that mean we should just sell all our Bitcoin and say fuck Bitcoin and become anti-Bitcoin activists? And I don't think that's the right answer either.
Well, before we go there, though, before we go with because I mean, we did in a way start with it can still be used in good ways, but I'd like to end on the positive note too. But let's make sure we talk about. Before we go to the surveillance part of it, because I don't want to miss that. I think that's super important to where this, again, the point we're making today in general is that I think it's clear that what you just laid out, it's a very valid question to ask whether or not this was started as a government operation. I mean, it's kind of hard to not see how clearly you just put that together with Tether, with, PayPal and the PayPal mafia and the current administration. And I would like you to show me how Teal falls in with that and how that connects currently with what's going on and what they're rolling out, and even with like the technocracy direction. But I think what's interesting is to see that even though that is kind of clearly the case, it is still, as you've made many arguments for, something that can still be used potentially to push back on what they're doing. And I think that is a lot of the ways they're trying to set this up so that becomes impossible. At least that's how I'm reading the way this goes forward. So go ahead and tell me about Thiel's connection to all of that, and how Palantir, which was essentially a CIA cutout, is kind of worked its way into that conversation. That becomes kind of the AI connection to all of it. And let's, end on that. How is this potentially going to be used if, worst case scenario, with the way that the Trump administration, or really, in my opinion, for those paying attention or maybe new to the Musk platform, whatever puppet president was doing this, it's not unique to the partisan side, but what they might do with that worst case scenario for surveillance, for tracking, carbon tracking, artificial intelligence kind of dynamics. Walk me through that, and we can
Sure. So I think there's two important things there. One, with the AI, which I think is really interesting, is that Bitcoin is arguably the first financial system ever created that you do not need to be human to use. You can have self-driving cars that have a Bitcoin wallet that get, you use your app and you order an Uber, and the self-driving car, probably a Tesla, comes to your, front doors, and you get in the car and you pay them Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general. But, Bitcoin started it, and you pay them Bitcoin, and the car itself has a wallet, and it drives you to its place. And then when it drops you off, if it needs gas or charging, it can go to a place and pay directly. It's a self contained agent. It doesn't need a third party. You could actually have a car basically that's a corporation on its own, rather than a fleet or whatever. So from the AI standpoint, we've basically given them being AI, a financial system that they can use. So you could theoretically have an AI that puts out an ad on Craigslist that pays a developer in Bitcoin to make it better or develop more things for it. Or
I can't even begin to talk about there's 150,000 different directions that could go in right now. My mind is terrifying.
Sure.
You're laying out. Go ahead.
Absolutely. But I don't necessarily think that's like, the main fear of Bitcoin, right? Like, I think theoretically they could find ways to do that anyway, but it isn't exactly. It is an interesting, like to me, as you pointed out, it's interesting that David Sachs is the crypto and AI czar. It's interesting that they're combining them together. But really, if you look at sort of the two pillars of the incoming technocracy, it really is AI and in digital currency and cryptocurrency. And I think one of the things that just sort of triangulates those two pillars is digital ID. And, you go to look at, well, what's Thiel's involvement with a lot of this? Palantir really is a very advanced AI system that is fed on the best data sources possible. And, who created the first digital ID? Facebook. It really was. It basically was the sly roundabout Trojan horse way for us to create our own digital identity system. We created a profile. We put our picture up there. We tagged the fucking squares on the faces to train the LLMs. And, we added the things that we like. And, we tagged where we were. And, we built the monster really ourselves. And Thiel was obviously introduced, I believe, to Zuckerberg through Ron Conway, who was kind of the handler of like Sean Parker, who was the Napster creator, who was a big part of, the file sharing revolution. And, I've written a decent amount about that, about, well, maybe file sharing was a way to also roundabout us to create bandwidth on the internet so they could launder our surveillance, because you could very easily, if there's a microphone in our computer recording everything we're doing and they're uploading it, but we don't have any peer-to-peer uploads on our system and on our routers, it'd be very easy to see. But if we're all downloading and uploading and sharing all of these, streaming videos, and there's massive amounts of content being sent around, it's really hard to see the data being sent from our devices. So perhaps, maybe the system was established to create, basically to launder surveillance data through the pipes of the internet, right? That's kind of a separate conversation, but interesting to think about. But the first identity systems online, it really was Facebook. And then you could argue Google also with Gmail and some things, and then even PayPal a little bit. And when you look at, how you sign into websites, right? It's like you can sign in with your Gmail, you can sign in with your Facebook, you can use your PayPal on all of these different websites to sign in. And so you start to look at the intersection between ID, digital ID, and surveillable financial systems and how we created that on the internet. Thiel was really there at the beginning of all of these things, or certainly Stanford University was there at the beginning of all these things with the Google boys. And then you even go a little generation back, the Sun Microsystems guys that really built. Eric Schmidt came out of Sun Microsystems, but Sun Microsystems was, they took the counterpath to Microsoft. Microsoft was personal computing. Sun was networks. They were like, it's all going to be on networks. You're never going to process anything on your own computer. It's all about network switching. So we're going to go build out the modern internet. And then they did. And Andy Bechtolsheim, I think is his name, who was the founder of Sun. Sun stands for Stanford University. I forget what the N is, but the Sun in Microsystems is from Stanford University because it was from a research project that was created on the campus. And he was the first person to fund the Google boys. So Thiel is kind of doing all this stuff at Stanford and is pulling all the best and brightest. David Sachs wrote for the Stanford Review for him and all that. And so he creates PayPal. And then what they find is that the main thing that you have to deal with when doing digital currency is all the fraud. It's just an incredible amount of fraud. So him and Max Levchin, who is the founding CTO, and in my mind, a very possible Satoshi candidate. He's a very big cryptographer who spent his entire time at college in Illinois working on distributed networks. And literally, there's a quote that you pulled up earlier of Thiel going to the beach in Anguilla, basically saying, I met Satoshi there. And while at that conference, Levchin did a talk where he showed the math of creating an open, transparent financial system, and that the way to do digital cash isn't anonymous, it's transparent. And then that was kind of what they did with PayPal. And so, they are creating all these anti-fraud algorithms, the CAPTCHA, that you use to get onto websites or whatever. That really came out of PayPal in a lot of ways. It was certainly popularized for you via PayPal. In 2004, they realized they have something really big there. And they created this anti-fraud algorithm that was named Igor, that was named after this Russian antagonist who kept just kind of being like, na, 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 to PayPal and stealing all this money. And so they created this whole system to keep one-upping him. And eventually they did. And they built this really incredible anti-fraud system. So in 2004, they basically, Thiel was like, hey, why don't we use this system to go track down terrorists? And so he privatized basically this DARPA cutout total information awareness. Yeah, sure.
Do you think that's actually what, do you think that was just, he's like, hey, let's start a business? Or do you actually think this was more of a, CIA facilitated direction?
Of course.
Well, I don't know what your research shows, because it certainly could be that he just thought of it and then he got co-opted by the CIA. But so do you think it was
No, I think it was very directly. Whitney Webb has written a ton about this, about I believe his name is Poindexter, who basically came to them and was like, hey, we've been working on this stuff. We call it total information awareness, TIA, and then we changed it to terrorist information awareness to kind of do the post September 11th sort of, well, let's build the surveillance state, but say it's about, terrorists, and then the nationals, the SEALs will fucking clap for it again. And it worked really well, right? And so I think there's basically this privatized version of this otherwise shuttered DARPA project. And I think that there's a lot of evidence of the paper trail that really connects directly there. Whitney also wrote this amazing article about the military origins of Facebook. That's kind of the same thing, that there was this DARPA project called LifeLog that shuttered the same day Facebook started. And both of the universities that these companies came out of were connected as part of this MDDS system that I'm releasing a piece on tomorrow. But regardless, so yes, I do think it was directly from the CIA. They were their first clients were the CIA for a really long time. It was, mainly CIA driven. And so Thiel, basically created this, panopticon, basically in the private sector at the whim of the U.S. intelligence community, that now had basically a digital Federal Reserve with PayPal behind it. A big part of intelligence and certainly why a lot of intelligence went out into the private sector is because funding is really hard to come by when you're doing black book operations. So that's why you see a lot of drug running and gun running, because, you know, that's a really easy way to get cash that's off the books. Bitcoin really fills that role in a very interesting way, and digital currency fills that role in a really interesting way, where you can pay people, just like it's cool that like I could pay you right now and no one could stop us, and that's sweet, and you could go pay it locally with something and there's literally no one that could stop you. An intelligence broker could, you know, buy a cache of data on like Etsy or something, of like the people that are buying things on Etsy, and then, you know, they have a whole cache of users and they can feed it into an or whatever. You know, Bitcoin, you know, works that way as a black book money also. But ironically, Bitcoin is transparency technology. There's no encryption in Bitcoin. Ironically, everything is open. You can see every transaction on the blockchain forever. Every single transaction that's ever been made on Bitcoin, I have a copy on my node right over there, every single one. So I think there's a great use case for, well, let me say one more thing. I have every transaction on a node over there on a hard drive, but it's useless to me because I don't have intelligence level analysis capabilities of being able to triangulate using other data of IP addresses and other things, people posting on social media being like, I bought Bitcoin today. And then you go and you look at when, and then you say, okay, they bought this much. And so when combined, when this transparency technology is combined with a program like Palantir, every single transaction that gets made on Bitcoin, 99.999%, is able to be parsed by these chain analysis companies. In-Q-Tel, which was a founder or a funder of Palantir, also, you know, funded chain analysis, which is a, you know, a data analytics firm for blockchains. You know, if you don't have basically nation state level analytics of the blockchain, it doesn't necessarily mean much to you. Like, I can't really do anything with the blockchain. I can look at some things through a block explorer and look up, you know, oh, Ukraine donations from FTX, or, you know, I can look at some things, but I need to know a lot about the data that's given to me by other sources. There's no way that I can really triangulate, you know, who was sending it initially and all these things. But a group like Palantir and a group like, like just government intelligence chain analysis, they really can do a lot of damage with Bitcoin at the ISP level. So Bitcoin being a transparency technology, when combined with AI that can parse all of this stuff, and when combined with data brokers like Palantir that have huge caches of information on not just American citizens, but, you know, the world, your privacy is nil to none on Bitcoin. There obviously are a lot of people working on stuff. There are ways to scale in layers that can be more private. You can use eCashments. There's a couple interesting things, but generally, as Brian McNeely from Sun Microsystems once infamously said, get over it. Nothing's private on the internet. And he's kind of right. And it's a scary position when we go to see that, oh, actually digital ID and their future financial system is going to be entirely online. It's very scary. So even if it's not a CBDC and the system actually does play out, as I've outlined with the Bitcoin and stable coins, it's one of the most transparent financial systems that could exist. It is way worse than cash.
Right.
And they're pushing cash away at the same time as adopting these, you know, private issued tokens on public blockchain. So I think it's really important for Bitcoiners to just like, or anybody really, like, if you understand this change is coming, Bitcoin will probably monetize like crazy if the US government wants to pay off their debt with it. It will have to appreciate immensely. I'm not a financial advisor. Like, I don't think, you know, do whatever you make your decisions for yourself, but there's a great possibility that there could be an extreme outcome where Bitcoin appreciates immensely, but it doesn't necessarily bring a lot of freedom to the world. It brings a lot of freedom to the US empire and extends their economic hegemon, but that might not be good for me and you and some other people. So understand the risks of Bitcoin and that, you know, it's not private. And, you know, there's a lot of ways that it could be empowering the state and the surveillance state immensely, paying black book operators and AI agents and these privatized, intelligence data brokers, and in effect, kind of, making our entire financial system, a buffet, feeding our data on a silver platter to them.
Man.
So
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, it really, it's you answered a very big question for me right there that I was kind of going to get to after you explained all this, which is ultimately the concern about the privacy aspect. And my point has been, and now you've evolved my understanding of this, is that yes, it's transparent, and that's actually one of the reasons the system works the way it does, but it is private when it comes to who is making the transaction because of the cryptographic address, and whether that's able to be circumvented with something we currently have. I think the argument is basically no. But what you highlighted is that when you intertwine these things, which it seems you laid out very well, that was almost the way it was designed to be, the intersection with, also Tether, but with Palantir and artificial intelligence, that they can use outside sources, what I'm doing online, what I posted about. And of course, if I stupidly post this is my new address, which I've done, but because I want it to be public, right? But that then connects it with your name online, but they could use this to find out that information. Now, that's just like an early step of privacy. But as you're highlighting the way that these continue to intertwine, I mean, we highlighted the most obvious, right? You highlighted the most, ones people, your mind can make sense of right now. But as I'm sure you've highlighted in other work, where this can go with artificial intelligence and carbon tracking and, this horrifying overlap with what you just outlined, as we're watching the administration, whether they know it or not, pretending to fight the very thing they seem to be rolling out. And that seems to be like a common tactic right now. All of this becomes very clear, back to the kind of the point we started at, that I think it's very obvious that this is being used against us. And you have really opened my mind to a few different points that make that even more clear right now. Of even some of the things I thought maybe were positives, but at the same time, the real positives still seem to exist, whether you want it with Bitcoin or Monero, that these things still seem to have a way to eventually circumvent this, maybe even right now. So I just think this is such a fascinating conversation. And really, some of the stuff you went through today, I think a lot of people are going to benefit from the way you laid it out to understand the timing of it, like the very clear track of how this came together, and whether you want to think that it was designed that way, or like I said, with Teal or not, or ultimately just used after the fact, it is still ending up in the same position, And so I think what your coverage today is going to help a lot of people. And I really hope people will continue to check out what you've done so far. And I think we should do another follow-up to this if you'd be down in like a couple of weeks or more, because I think there's so many more ways we could get into how this may be used and how it goes forward. But, let's just go ahead and put a pin in there for now, because I think the real picture here is the way that this is going to go forward. And that I think we should be standing up in droves to try to fight to maintain. I mean, I know we all have different opinions on how it should be, but I think collectively the community still has a generalized idea that this is not supposed to be pro-government, pro-US dollar, outside of those that just want to make money off of it. So I say we lean into that and try to find ways to use what you're presenting to push back. So thank you for being here today, brother. And, anything else you want to lay out, last notes or upcoming events or anything you want to discuss before we leave today?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I think just to leave on a little bit of a positive note of the idea that, I do think that this is still a game and still an active thing that, a lot of people, including a very, the Savanina Moose, who wrote the Bitcoin Standard, is like, kind of not attacked. It wasn't mean, but basically it was like, what you're doing is preventing people from, going towards Bitcoin and being involved with Bitcoin. And that's really the only thing that can save them. And I think that that's wrong. I don't think anything is a silver bullet here. There's a lot of things that can save us depending on what we're looking at to be saved in, and I think, again, it's exit, build, and find a life that, is really fun for you and really fulfilling. And I would not literally be here talking to you or in my life or where I am if the Dread Pirate Robert 2.0, the Silk Road guy, didn't come into that bar and explain Bitcoin to me. And it's opened my world and my mind in a whole ton of ways. And I've learned so much about financial, economic, monetary things, about myself. I personally was at the time working in bars. I had a lot of substance issues and a lot of things. And I finally found something that I wanted to put my money and time into that wasn't just partying. And there was a lot of really good things that happened to me because of my exposure to Bitcoin, including being able to say, see you later when I came up against some issues at my former employer. And I can have a beautiful life and a beautiful family, and I'm very excited about that. So I think the Bitcoin game is not to be ignored. I think it's to be really considered. Just do it safely and do it correctly, and understand that again, everything's a tool, and money is one of the biggest tools. It can be used to control, and it can use to empower and free people. And so I feel very empowered and free because of Bitcoin. And I understand that that's not going to be the case for everybody moving forward. The next 8 billion people, that probably won't be true for. So I think that it is my responsibility as someone that was able to take advantage of this sea change to warn and hopefully push this game towards in a direction where I can leave it as permissionless and as empowering as it was when I found it. So I think that, there's a lot of pushback now, especially I think since a lot of independent media people have been kind of pushing back on the Bitcoin narrative since Trump pushed it back, that it's like, hey, it's this terrible thing, ignore it. I think it can be a Trojan horse and all of these things, and also still be something that's really important to consider. So, because you can use Bitcoin as a way to exit the system, even though it is now becoming the new system. So it's just an important axiom to consider, and I hope people do. And yeah, Ryan, thanks so much for having me. It was an absolute blast.
Yeah, thanks, brother. And I think that's a great way to end it right there, is that really, like cash, for example, which clearly is the tool of, or any other element like that. You can clearly still use that to find ways to free yourself from it, like as you eloquently put. And I think that's very clearly something we should consider, as always pointed out. And I will end with a point that I think is important here, guys, that as Mark's laid out, as Whitney has laid out, as plenty of other people, like whether with total information awareness to Palantir, it seems to be a pretty obvious common game right now for them to transition it seems to be pretty consistently a DARPA project, but a government project into something that is now, public face, totally not the same thing. In this case, literally XAI, explainable AI from DARPA, ending in 2021. Musk buys Twitter in 2022. Months later, names, well, I guess out of the gate, calls it X, like X.com, then starts XAI, a totally new artificial intelligence program. And if you read into this, it is exactly the same program. This overlaps with terrifying things of using social media to sort of, train its out, which he's telling you publicly, using Twitter to train this thing. And then using, conversations like digital twins. And by the way, something we should talk about next time we talk. But I think the point here, guys, is to see how this is clearly this game. I'm not question everything, including that I could be wrong, but I'm just like Mark is saying, just ask whether you think some of these people are unwittingly rolling you out into something that may not be in your best interest, or maybe even that they know that. When you see Thiel and Karp and the rest of them actively involved on either side of whoever won the election, now you have a Zionist technocrat packed administration all rolling out all the things that we 30 seconds ago were telling the world were the problem. And just ask yourself whether you are being it's a shell game, or, whatever you want to call it, that you're being played. So thank you, Mark, for really laying out some fantastic information today. And I'm looking forward to talking with you again.
Cheers. Same, Ryan. Thanks.
And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.